It was a cold autumn evening when Jake, an experienced trucker, found himself hauling a heavy load across a stretch of desolate highway, the kind of road that rarely saw other travelers. The sun had long set, and the black expanse of the night sky was dotted with stars, casting an eerie glow over the long stretch of asphalt. He glanced at the clock, 1:45 a.m. "Shouldn't be much further," Jake muttered to himself, adjusting his grip on the steering wheel. The low hum of the engine was the only sound that kept him company as the truck rumbled down the empty road. His eyes grew heavy, fatigue creeping in. He had been on the road for days, the miles dragging on with nothing to break the monotony. Suddenly his headlights flickered, casting strange shadows across the empty highway. The eerie quiet of the night seemed to deepen. The road stretched endlessly ahead, with no sign of a gas station or a rest stop for miles. Just as Jake was about to check his GPS for a nearby place to stop, he saw it. A small, dimly lit rest stop appeared on the horizon, tucked behind a few trees. It wasn't on his map, but Jake didn't think twice. He needed rest, and it seemed like his only option. The truck pulled into the parking lot, which had only a few trucks parked under the flickering lights. Jake stepped out, the cold night air biting at his skin as he walked toward the tiny convenience store. But before he could reach the door, the air shifted. A cold chill washed over him, and he felt a strange pressure, like something was watching him from the shadows. Shaking off the unease, he bought a coffee and returned to his truck, locking the door behind him. He reclined the seat, ready to get some sleep, but just as he was drifting off, there was a soft knock on the window. He shot up, his heart racing. Outside there was no one, no cars, no people, just the empty lot and the darkness beyond. He felt his pulse quicken, but tried to shake it off. "Must have been the wind," he muttered to himself, though the unease wouldn't leave him. Jake tried to sleep, but the night seemed endless. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard it, a soft, persistent tapping on the window right next to his ear. It was like someone was trying to get his attention, but when he opened his eyes, there was no one there. He glanced at the clock, 2:45 a.m. The tapping came again, louder this time. It was coming from the other side of the truck. Jake's heart thudded in his chest. He reached for the door handle, but his hand froze. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't human. With trembling hands, he opened the door just enough to peek outside. The parking lot was still empty except for the other trucks. But one of the truck drivers had his headlights on, and they shone brightly against the darkness, casting long shadows across the lot. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he noticed the figure standing in front of the truck, a tall, gaunt man, his face hidden in the shadows. Jake blinked. The figure was gone. There was nothing but the empty lot again. Just then, the tapping came again, this time from the driver's side. Jake's mind raced. He had to get out of there. Jake quickly climbed back into the truck, locking the door once again. The tapping didn't stop. It continued, growing more urgent, as if whatever it was wanted to be noticed. But Jake refused to acknowledge it. His mind told him to drive away, but something kept him rooted in place. He reached for the ignition, but before he could start the truck, the lights flickered. His dashboard dimmed, the eerie sound of static filled the cab, and a voice crackled over the radio. "Leave, before it's too late," the voice whispered, barely audible. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He slammed the radio off, trying to steady his shaking hands. His heart pounded in his chest and he felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. What was going on here? Why had he chosen this rest stop of all places? The tapping came again, louder this time, accompanied by an unsettling scraping noise against the side of the truck. Slowly he turned his head towards the driver's side mirror. His stomach dropped as he saw the figure in the reflection. It was him, the gaunt man. He was standing right next to the truck, his face still obscured by shadows. But this time Jake could see his eyes, wide, hollow and lifeless. The figure smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was something far darker. Without thinking, Jake started the truck and floored the gas pedal. The truck roared to life, its engine loud in the still night. He threw it into gear and sped away, leaving the rest stop behind. Jake didn't stop. He kept driving, the miles blurring together as he raced down the dark highway. But no matter how fast he went, the strange feelings, the whispers and the shadows followed him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being hunted by something far older, far darker than he could comprehend. The highway stretched on endlessly. There were no exits, no signs of civilization. It was as if he had driven into another world, one where the rules of reality no longer applied. As the hours passed, Jake's exhaustion began to take its toll. His eyelids drooped and his vision blurred. Just as he thought he might fall asleep at the wheel, he saw something in the distance, a faint light. It wasn't another vehicle, but a small glow on the horizon, like a candle flickering in the distance. As he got closer, the light became brighter, and Jake's stomach churned with dread. The glow was coming from another rest stop. "No," he whispered to himself, but his truck seemed to steer toward it of its own accord, the wheel slipping from his hands as if pulled by an invisible force. The truck rolled to a stop in front of the rest area. This one looked like the others, dim, lifeless, and abandoned. But as he got out of the truck, something was different. There was a sense of foreboding, an unnatural stillness in the air. And then he saw them. Dozens of figures, all standing in the shadows of the parking lot. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, staring at him with an unnatural hunger. Jake backed away slowly, fear rising in his chest. Suddenly the figures began to move. They shuffled forward, their faces twisted in grotesque smiles, their eyes empty and lifeless. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he realized the truth. These weren't just people. These were souls, trapped spirits of lost truckers who had passed through this cursed highway, never to escape. The whispering grew louder. "You can't leave. You can never leave." Jake turned to flee, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift. The rest stop wasn't a rest stop at all. It was a prison, a trap set for those foolish enough to stop, and now it had claimed him. The last thing Jake saw before everything went black was the gaunt figure, the one who had first haunted him. The figure smiled, his lips curling into a malevolent grin. "You're one of us now," it whispered. And the trucker was never seen again. Jake, a seasoned trucker, had seen it all. The long stretches of lonely roads, the exhaustion, the endless nights. None of it fazed him anymore, or so he thought. One cold autumn night, after hauling a load from Texas, Jake found himself on a remote stretch of the infamous Route 66. Well past midnight, the faint hum of his truck engine was the only sound on the road, and the dark sky above seemed to close in around him, swallowing the horizon. There was no moon tonight, just endless blackness that seemed to drag on. He had passed through towns before, but this stretch, this was different. There was an oppressive quiet that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The road seemed endless, and as he checked his GPS, he saw there were no upcoming exits, no signs of life for miles. After driving for hours with no other vehicles in sight, Jake saw a faint glow in the distance. A gas station, maybe? He hoped so. He was running low on fuel, and the trucker's habit of never turning down a chance to rest was creeping in. The truck rolled to a stop in front of a gas station that looked older than anything he had seen on the road in years. The pumps were rusty, the lights flickered, and there was something about the place that felt off. Jake climbed out of the truck, stretching his stiff legs. He walked inside the small convenience store, greeted by the soft jingle of the bell above the door. The shelves were stocked with outdated snacks. The floor creaked beneath his boots, and the air smelled stale. Behind the counter, an old man with a weathered face glanced up. "You the only one here?" Jake asked, looking around. "Ain't nobody else been through here in a long while," the old man rasped. "You might want to head out soon. Not a safe stretch of road for folks like you." Jake chuckled nervously. "I've been driving for over 10 years. I'll be fine." The old man didn't respond. Instead, he slid a cup of coffee across the counter, his eyes narrowing as he stared at Jake, almost as if sizing him up. Just watch out for the others," the man muttered under his breath. Jake raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. He grabbed the coffee, paid, and headed back to his truck. Jake didn't think much of the strange encounter. After all, it was a late-night stop, and everyone had their quirks. As he climbed back into the truck and pulled back onto the highway, he could still feel the odd sensation that something was watching him. The stretch of road seemed even emptier now. No signs of life, no traffic, just the darkness and the distant hum of his engine. He checked the time. It was nearly 3 a.m. Fatigue was setting in, but he kept his eyes on the road. That's when he saw the headlights in the rearview mirror. At first they were distant, but then they began to close in. He checked his mirrors, and the lights were getting closer, too fast, as if someone was tailing him. Annoyed, Jake sped up, trying to outrun whatever vehicle was behind him. But it didn't matter. The headlights remained right on his tail, flickering as if they were somehow toying with him. His pulse quickened as the truck's engine growled in protest. He looked ahead but saw nothing but the endless stretch of road. The mysterious headlights were still there, but when he glanced in the rearview mirror again, they were gone. Confused, Jake slammed on the brakes and pulled to the side of the road. His eyes scanned the horizon. There were no cars in sight, no headlights, no signs of anyone nearby. He sat there in the darkness for what felt like an eternity, wondering if it had all been in his head. But deep down he knew it wasn't. Something was wrong. Jake continued driving, the unease gnawing at him. He reached for the radio, desperate for any distraction, but all he got was static. He tried again, the static breaking only to give way to a low, guttural hum. The hum grew louder, rising into an eerie melody that filled the cab. It was unsettling, like the sound of distant voices singing in an unfamiliar language. Suddenly the truck began to shake. The steering wheel vibrated violently as if something invisible was trying to force the truck off the road. Jake's hands tightened around the wheel, fighting against the strange force pulling at him. The truck swerved as he tried to regain control, and when he glanced at the passenger seat, he swore he saw a figure out of the corner of his eye, dark, twisted, and impossibly tall. The figure was staring at him, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Jake slammed his foot on the gas pedal, speeding down the highway, trying to shake whatever it was off, but the figure remained, lurking just out of his direct sight. Finally, he pulled off at the next exit, an isolated, dark rest stop, not on his map. It was a last resort. The lights flickered above him as he parked the truck. The cold air bit into his skin as he stepped out, his legs shaking. He didn't feel safe, but the strange humming from the truck had stopped. The rest stop was abandoned. The restroom was run down, the building empty, and the small diner was dark. But the trucker instinct told him to stay alert. He wasn't alone here. As he walked to the diner, the door creaked open by itself. Inside there was nothing just darkness and dust. That was when he heard it, the scraping sound against the window. Turning quickly, Jake was met with the reflection of the figure he had seen in the truck. This time it was standing directly behind him, inches away. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. Yet the cold breath on the back of his neck told him something was wrong. He hurried back to his truck, jumped into the driver's seat and locked the doors. His hands shook as he turned the ignition, but the engine sputtered and died. It wouldn't start. He tried again. Nothing. Panic set in. Jake banged his fists against the steering wheel. Outside, the sound of footsteps drew closer. He could feel them. He wasn't alone. He wasn't just hearing things. Then a voice echoed in his head, a whispering, raspy voice, so faint but so clear. You can never leave. We're all trapped here. Jake's eyes widened. He wasn't imagining this. Suddenly, a light flickered in the distance. Headlights. Not far away, a group of trucks rolled up to the rest stop. Their engines were silent, but their lights illuminated the parking lot in a harsh, unsettling glow. But there was something off. As Jake looked closer, he noticed the drivers. They were staring at him through their windows. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide open and lifeless. It was then that Jake realized these weren't ordinary truckers. These were the lost souls of those who had once driven this highway, trapped in an eternal loop. They had all stopped here, and now they were cursed to roam the highway, waiting for the next traveler to join them. Jake's heart raced. He had to escape. He tried again to start the truck, his hands trembling as he turned the key, but it was no use. The engine refused to come to life. The lights of the other trucks grew brighter and their engines hummed to life one by one. The figures in the cabs didn't move. They just stared, lifeless. A sharp pain pierced Jake's chest, and for the first time in years, he felt a cold, consuming fear. A fear that told him that no matter what he did, he would never leave this place. He had become part of the cycle, one of the cursed travelers doomed to wander forever. The lights grew blinding, the air thick with a suffocating weight, and in the distance he could hear the whispers once more, calling him to join them. "You can't leave. You're one of us now." Charlie was a long-haul trucker known for keeping a strict schedule. The life of the road suited him. No family, no strings, just him and the open highways. But even a seasoned driver like Charlie had heard whispers of cursed stretches of road, places where the rules of reality bent and travelers disappeared. He never believed in those stories. That was until he took the Devil's Overpass. It was a chilly November night, and Charlie was cutting through Nevada on Route 395. His GPS had started acting up, recalculating incessantly before giving him a strange reroute. one that showed a shortcut shaving 45 minutes off his drive time. The new path veered off onto a lonely highway and led to an overpass he'd never seen before. Charlie was skeptical Nevada roads could be tricky and many didn't show up on older maps, but time was money, and he wasn't about to lose a load over a technical glitch. He turned onto the dark road, the overpass looming in the distance like a jagged scar against the night sky. As he approached, an uneasy feeling settled in his gut. The overpass was massive, more like a bridge suspended in a shadow, but there was something wrong with it. It looked unfinished. Parts of the structure faded into the dark as though swallowed by the night itself. Must be an old road, Charlie muttered to himself. He brushed off the unease and pressed forward, the sound of his tires echoing louder than usual as he ascended. Halfway across the overpass, the fog rolled in, thick and unnatural. It swallowed the truck, the headlights barely cutting through the dense grey. Charlie slowed, gripping the wheel tightly. The road seemed endless, stretching on far longer than it should. Then he saw her. A woman stood in the middle of the road, illuminated by his high beams. She was wearing a torn white dress, her hair dishevelled, and her bare feet planted firmly on the asphalt. Charlie hit the brakes hard, the truck screeching to a halt mere feet away from her. Heart pounding, he leaned out the window. "You all right, lady? You lost or something?" She didn't answer. Her face was turned away from him, but her body remained eerily still. Against his better judgment, Charlie climbed down from the truck, leaving the engine idling. "Hey," he called out, stepping closer. She finally turned toward him, and Charlie stumbled back. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with empty black pits where her eyes should have been. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then she pointed a trembling finger past him towards his truck. Charlie whipped around, but the fog obscured everything. When he turned back, the woman was gone. Shaking, he ran back to his truck, locking the doors behind him. He floored the gas pedal, desperate to leave the overpass behind. But no matter how far he drove, the bridge never seemed to end. The static on the CB radio broke the silence. "Breaker 1-9. You shouldn't have come here." A deep, distorted voice crackled through the speakers. Charlie's hand shot to the dial, twisting it frantically. "Who is this? What the hell is going on?" The voice came again, more insistent this time. "Turn back now, before it's too late." Suddenly, a pair of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror, barreling toward him at an impossible speed. They were blinding, burning like twin suns in the fog. Charlie gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel tighter as the lights drew closer. The truck behind him was massive, black, with chrome that gleamed like polished bone. It roared closer, its horn blaring like a beast's scream. Just as it seemed about to crash into him, the truck veered to the side and pulled alongside him. Charlie glanced out his window and froze. There was no driver. The The cab was empty, but the engine roared with life. The phantom truck swerved closer, forcing him towards the edge of the overpass. Charlie slammed on the brakes and the ghostly vehicle disappeared into the fog ahead. Breathing heavily, Charlie checked his GPS again. The screen was blank, the device completely unresponsive. He was alone, with no way to navigate off this cursed road. As Charlie continued driving, the fog began to dissipate, revealing the edge of the overpass. But relief was short-lived. Shadows danced along the bridge's railing, shifting and twisting like living things. He tried to ignore them, focusing on the road, but they grew bolder, creeping closer to the truck. The shadows took shape, figures of people, their bodies flickering like a bad signal. One by one they stepped into the road, forcing Charlie to slow down. There were dozens of them, all staring at him with those same hollow eyes as the woman he had seen earlier. Then he recognized one of them. Dan, he whispered, his throat dry. Dan had been his mentor when he first started trucking. The man had vanished years ago, his truck found abandoned on a remote stretch of highway. And now, here he was, standing among the shadowy figures, his face pale and lifeless. "Turn around, Charlie," Dan's voice echoed in his mind. "Turn around before it takes you too." But there was nowhere to turn. The shadows closed in, their hollow eyes burning into Charlie's soul. His hands shook as he pressed the gas pedal, swerving around them, desperate to escape. The end of the overpass was finally in sight. A faint red glow illuminated the horizon, casting the road in an ominous light, but the truck's engine began to sputter, the needles on the dashboard spinning wildly. It was as if the overpass itself was trying to keep him there. The CB radio crackled again. "You can't leave without paying the price." Charlie ignored the voice, slamming his foot on the gas. The truck roared forward, its headlights cutting through the crimson haze. The end of the overpass drew closer, but so did the figures. They were running now, their twisted forms chasing him, their hands clawing at the truck's trailer. The black truck reappeared in front of him, blocking the exit. Its headlights blazed and its horns screamed like a banshee. Charlie gritted his teeth, determination overpowering his fear. He wasn't going to die here. With a final surge of adrenaline, he veered to the side, smashing through the railing of the overpass. The truck plunged into the darkness below, and for a moment there was only silence. When Charlie awoke, he was lying on the side of a deserted highway, his truck nowhere in sight. His body ached, but he was alive. The overpass was gone, replaced by an unbroken stretch of asphalt that led back to Route 395. He stumbled to his feet, shaking his head in disbelief. Had it all been a nightmare? But as he looked down at his arm, he saw a strange mark burned into his skin, a symbol he didn't recognize, but one that pulsed with an unnatural heat. Weeks later, truckers on Route 395 began reporting strange sightings. a black truck with no driver, a woman in white, and a bridge that appeared only to those foolish enough to follow their GPS into the unknown. Charlie never spoke of what happened to him, but every time he passed that stretch of road, he felt the mark on his arm burn, as if warning him, the Devil's Overpass is always waiting. Kyle had been driving for hours, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. The road was empty, the only company being the hum of his rig's engine and the occasional flicker of lights from passing trucks. It was well past midnight when the sign for the last rest stop before the Nevada border appeared on the horizon. The light from the sign barely pierced the thick fog that had rolled in. Kyle had seen this rest stop before, on his previous trips, but tonight something felt different. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and unease gnawing at him. His GPS indicated a rest area, but it wasn't on the main route he usually took. Curious, he pulled off the highway, the wheels crunching over the gravel as he made his way to the isolated stop. The rest stop was eerily quiet. No trucks, no lights except for the flickering street lamp near the diner. The building looked old, as if it had been here for decades without a soul to care for it. Kyle rubbed his eyes and pulled his truck up beside the empty lot. His plan was to grab a coffee and stretch his legs. Maybe this was a sign he needed to stop for the night. As Kyle stepped into the diner, the door creaked loudly, and the smell of stale coffee and grease hit him immediately. The diner was empty except for one figure sitting at the counter. A man hunched over, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. "Hey there," Kyle said, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. "You open?" The man didn't answer. He didn't even move. Kyle glanced around. The diner was practically abandoned, and the flickering neon sign outside reflected off the cracked windows, making the place feel even more isolated. He walked up to the counter, trying to shake off the unease crawling up his spine. "I'll have a coffee," he called to the waitress behind the counter, but she didn't respond either. She stood still, staring out the window as if in a trance. "Is something wrong?" Kyle asked, leaning in closer. The waitress slowly turned her head, her eyes wide and unblinking, her face pale. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered hoarsely. "No one ever leaves." Before Kyle could respond, the man at the counter stood up, his hat still obscuring his face. He walked past Kyle without a word, heading toward the back of the diner. Kyle's instincts screamed at him to leave, but he shook his head, convinced it was just the fatigue talking. Kyle drank his coffee quickly, trying to shake the feeling that he was being watched. The clock above the diner's door ticked louder than usual, each second feeling like an eternity. He glanced out the window again, and that's when he saw it. The fog. It wasn't just any fog. It was thick, swirling unnaturally, almost like it was alive, moving in unpredictable waves. As he stared at it, the mist seemed to take shape, like shadows weaving through the air, drawing closer to the diner. Kyle quickly stood up. his heart racing. He turned to the waitress, who was still standing in the same spot, her face frozen in a blank stare. "I think I should go," he muttered. Before he could leave, the man in the hat returned. This time his face was visible, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes, skin stretched thin across his skull, his mouth twisted into a strange grin. "You can't leave," the man said, his voice low, rasping, almost like a whisper in the wind. Kyle's stomach dropped. "What do you mean? What's going on here?" The man didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at Kyle with those cold, empty eyes, and that's when Kyle noticed something in the fog outside. Figures moving through the mist, their forms barely visible, but unmistakably human. And they were coming closer. Kyle rushed out the door, his heart pounding in his chest. As soon as he stepped outside, the air turned cold, too cold for a desert night. The fog surrounded him, thick and suffocating. He squinted, trying to make out shapes in the distance, but everything was blurred, as if the world had been reduced to shadows and silhouettes. He reached for his phone, but it was dead, no signal. Panic began to set in as he realized he was completely cut off from the outside world. Then he heard it. A voice, faint at first but growing louder, echoing through the fog. "Help! Us!" Kyle froze. The voice was desperate, filled with anguish, and it was coming from all directions. He turned around, but there was no one there, just the fog thickening around him, choking out any light. "Who's there?" Kyle called, but his voice was swallowed by the mist. The figures in the fog were closer now, their shapes becoming more distinct. Pale faces, hollow eyes, twisted limbs. They reached out for him, their hands clawing through the air like they were trying to drag him into the fog with them. Kyle stumbled backward, his chest tight with fear. "No, stay away!" But it was too late. The figures were upon him and he was pulled into the fog, his screams lost in the eerie silence of the rest stop. When Kyle awoke, he was lying on the floor of the diner, his head pounding. The fog had dissipated and the diner seemed to be different. The air was thick with a suffocating silence. He stood up slowly, looking around. The man in the hat was gone, so was the waitress. But the faces of the figures in the fog, they were everywhere now, their hollow eyes staring at him from the corners of the room. They whispered in unison, their voices indistinct, like a chorus of souls trapped in an eternal limbo. Kyle's breath quickened. He tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. He pushed and pulled, but the door was sealed shut. It was as if the diner itself had become a prison. The voices grew louder, their whispers drowning out his thoughts. Then, in a moment of horror, Kyle realized the truth. This place wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. The rest stop was a trap, and anyone who stopped here was doomed to become part of the mist, a ghost trapped in an endless cycle. A voice echoed in his mind, the same voice that had whispered to him before. No one ever leaves. We are the lost, and now you are one of us." As Kyle's vision blurred, his body began to fade, his form dissolving into the fog. And as his final breath left his body, he understood the truth. The rest stop was a limbo for souls who had once wandered too close to its pull. The next night, another trucker would pull into the same diner, and the cycle would begin again.